Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the second of AAUW California's 2020 Virtual Fund Luncheons. It would be nice to be gathering in person with a room full of smiling faces and a nice meal. But COVID-19 pandemic calls for safety measures that disallow such events. Fortunately, we have access to technology that makes online events such as this webinar possible. We are even more blessed with our communication team, without whom events such as this would likely be total chaos. Although I'm new to the fund committee this year, the majority of the committee are quite experienced and probably familiar to you. They are Janice Cook of Victor Valley, Sharon Weststaffer of Long Beach and Stockton, Liz Bathgate of Hayward Castro Valley, Judy Horan of California Online, Sharman Goring of Sacramento. Thank you to Jan for scheduling our speakers for this webinar today. If you wish to schedule a fellow to speak for an event, Jan will be happy to assist you. There is also a link to the Schedule a Speaker button in the chat during the webinar. Judy and Sharman are our AAUW Legacy Circle coordinators for California. You will be meeting Sharman later today. I do not need to tell you how important the work of AAUW is, especially in today's world, a time where we are seeing so much of the progress already achieved, not only for women, but culturally, ethnically, environmentally, and so on, being placed in danger of regress. The work of AAUW is more important now than ever. AAUW Fund is necessary to drive everything that we do. Today, we celebrate some of that work. I'm excited to share that in 2020-2021, AAUW Fund raised $3.5 million and awarded funds to over 200 fellows and grantees. 24 of those were in California. Of course, you will be meeting 10 of them today, and we have one from Ecuador and one from Jamaica. As there's no charge for the webinar, if your budget allows, we ask that you consider a donation to AAUW Fund and note that it is in honor of AAUW California Fund Luncheon. There is a donation button on the website in the article on the homepage where you registered for this webinar. A link will also be posted in the chat during this webinar. Before I hand you over to our next speaker, I have one final urging on behalf of AAUW California, the Public Policy Committee, and A Nation in Crisis. Please fulfill your responsibility as a citizen of the United States of America and vote. At this time, please welcome our exceptional AAUW California President for 2020-2022 and past Fund Chair, Diane Owens.
Hey, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess it is already, right? So good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that so many of you could join us today. These luncheons, even though this one's virtual, are so important and really so exciting for all of us to be able to get together and to hear these wonderful young women speak about their work that is funded by AAUW Fund. 2 weeks ago, we heard from 8 exceptional fellows and grant recipients that are doing such important work. And today we have the honor of hearing from 10 of them. And I just am more impressed every year at the caliber of the fellows and grant recipients that we have. And you will be too at the end of this session. We are so fortunate to be AAUW members and to be supporting AAUW Fund. I've been with AAUW Fund for a very long time, and it really is the heart of AAUW. Without AAUW Fund, there would be no programs and AAUW would not be doing all the wonderful work that it does. Without AAUW Fund, we wouldn't have Nick Whistle, we wouldn't have Work Smart, Start Smart, we wouldn't have the Legal Advocacy Fund. So it is so important, and I appreciate your donations today because that will help the fellows and grant recipients for next year. So as is the custom when we have these luncheons, and we usually have 3 of them, I am happy to announce the past presidents that are in the audience. Normally I could look out and see them, but today I can only see their names. So we have past presidents of AUW California, Jane Niemeyer with us today, Donna Lilly, Kathleen Doty, Sharon Schuster, who is also a past president of AUW National, Chris Winter, and Gloria Taylor. And from AUW on the board, we have Sherry Sorkin with us today, who is from the Marin branch and a board member of the National Board. And also today, we have Gloria Blackwell, who's a senior vice president of fellowships and programs. So welcome, Gloria. I'm glad you could join us. We also have many of our board members here today. Besides Judy, we have Donna Lilly, who is our CU representative. We have Kathy Harper, who is the director of public policy. Raleigh Wendorf, who is our chief financial officer. Susan DeGretti, who is our state Tech Trek coordinator. Carol Hostgraf, who is our branch assistance director. And Janice Lee, who takes care of nominations and elections, very important. And Lynn Batchelor, our secretary, who takes all the minutes for all of our meetings. And Sharman Gehring, who you'll meet just later, who is our meetings planner. And we couldn't do any of this without Sandy Gabe, who is our, she's my assistant actually, and she's also our guru that runs all of these webinars. We couldn't do that without her. So we're really thankful that Sandy is with us. And with that, I'm going to introduce someone who is no stranger to California, who usually comes every year to join us at the luncheons, and that's Heather Miller. Heather is the AUW Advancement Director in Washington, and she's also the head of Planned Giving. So let's give a warm welcome to Heather Miller.
Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be with you. I am AAUW National's Director of Advancement. Also, that means that I work with our major donors and our planned giving donors on their philanthropy, and it's my honor to do that. This is such a wonderful event and such a wonderful opportunity to hear from so many of AAUW's fellows and grantees about the exciting and important work that they do. So it's wonderful to be here. We're here to celebrate the work and achievements of our fellows, and what a truly brilliant group they are. Let's also remember right now AAUW's history of granting fellowships. It dates back to 1888. That's a 132-year-long continuing commitment to educational opportunities for women. Today, AAUW has over $120 million in endowments and endowment funds, thanks to the generosity of our members over the years. This means that we give out at least $4 million annually each year to our fellows and grantees. But we know that today, women graduate from college at a higher rate than men and even earn more advanced degrees than men do. And that's why our mission calls on us to meet women and girls where they are today. This is why we're now laser focused on our strategic plan areas of focus. And they are shown here. Removing bias from education, fighting for fair pay and economic equity, and advancing women in leadership. Education, which includes our Title IX work, thanks in large part to all of our members throughout the years, and most recently to a very generous bequest from the late Nancy Grace Roman, is thriving. Economic security includes economic equity, including AAUW's crucial work addressing the gender pay gap, addressing women and student debt, and the motherhood penalty, plus women in retirement. And our award-winning work Smart Online, along with our signature Start Smart program, are all instrumental to our success in economic security and economic equity. Moving now to leadership, where our work addresses the barriers and biases preventing women from attaining the highest leadership roles in nearly every sector. For example, We know women remain significantly underrepresented at the highest rungs of government and corporations. From education to finance to law and medicine, AAUW is addressing the leadership gap through innovative programs such as AAUW's Empower program and the National Conference for College Women Student Leaders, affectionately called NCWSL. Interwoven through all of our work, of course, is AAUW's renowned research, because facts have always informed our work, and our research will always continue to inform our work. Yesterday and today, we empower women and girls by providing tools and resources, and we continue to do so long into the future thanks to you, our members and supporters. There has never been a better time for you to be involved. You may have seen that AAUW's National Office has launched a series of interactive online webinars with topics ranging from State of the Association to conversations on race, equity, and inclusion to the legacy of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg and so many others. These can all be found on our website, as well as upcoming webinars to be announced. These virtual programs are absolutely free, and they are serving to keep us all connected and informed during the pandemic. COVID-19 is shining a spotlight on the inequities in our nation, and this makes us even more committed to our mission and vision of equity for all. There are many ways to engage with us in this important work, especially with the 2020 election right around the corner. You can join us on the webinars, of course, and share those recordings with others. The webinars can foster further discussion with your branch. And of course, you can sign up to be a 2-minute activist, and we hope that you will. Many of you already are. And take action and help combat voter suppression and many other pressing issues of today. And you can support our organization through generous contributions to ensure that this critical work continues. Finally, if you are an AAUW visionary who cares deeply about the future of our mission and this organization, I hope you will consider joining the Legacy Circle. You're going to hear more about the Legacy Circle at the end of this program, and many of the people on this call today are Legacy Circle members. Right now would be the moment when I would ask them to all stand up if we were together in person, and so that we could applaud and recognize all of our wonderful Legacy Circle members. And I wish we could do that, and hopefully we will do that again in the near future. I also want to remind everyone that you can find links to all of the things that I've mentioned for ways to stay involved with AAUW through our monthly newsletter, Mission in Action. So be sure you look for it in your email. This month's Mission in Action includes topics like 3 tips for virtual fundraising and programs. In fact, we just recently hosted a group of branch and state leaders to talk about virtual fundraising as one of our national webinars. And also Mission in Action this month talks about the election, and please apply to be on AAUW Nationals board. Latinas in the Pay Gap. October 29th is Latina Equal Pay Day. And also, of course, the link to our webinars. So please do look at Mission in Action for links to all of these important programs and opportunities. And with that, I thank you for being here, and I'd like to turn it back to Judy.
Okay, actually, thank you, Heather, for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And next year, hopefully, we'll be able to meet in person so that you can fly out to California and join us at all of our luncheons next year.
Thank you. I inadvertently turned off my video, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Heather. We appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. And so it's my great pleasure to begin our speakers. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Rebecca Bruner. And she's an American Fellow studying at the University of California at Berkeley. Her discipline is biology, and her specialty and her degree is a PhD, and wildlife conservation, tropical ecology. Becca, she goes by Becca. Becca is a conservation biologist with more than 10 years of field experience in the tropics. She currently studies how acoustic space and gene flow affect amphibian populations in forested versus human-dominated landscapes, informing management strategies that expand the habitat potential of agriculture. She conducts this research in Ecuador at some exciting sounding places, which she's going to tell you about. She's also passionate about education and hopes to teach classroom and field-based courses as a professor. So welcome, Becca.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, my name's Becca. Thank you so much for having me. And before I start, I just wanted to thank all of the donors for making this possible. I feel really fortunate to be part of such a wonderful and inspiring community of women. So thank you so much for your support. It's really amazing to be working on my dissertation and not working 3 jobs while doing so. So thank you. So just a little bit of background about me. Should I tell you next slide? Thank you. So I am from Illinois originally, from a really small cornfield town. And I grew up with a single mom who's my best friend, and she has always really encouraged me to follow my dreams. So I wouldn't be here without her. So I wanted to acknowledge her, especially at a women's luncheon. And maybe because I grew up in such a monoculture environment, I've always dreamed about jungles. And I feel really fortunate to be a biologist, and I get to work in them all the time, which is really wonderful. So next, please. So I study frogs, and this was supposed to be a video, but if you want, you can text me in the chat and I will, or in the Q&A, and I can send a video of it. But I've always loved frogs, and not only because I think they're incredible creatures, and this glass frog on the right here is called that because they have transparent bellies, and a lot of them you can actually see their hearts beating through their stomach, which is really incredible. And so just the biodiversity that frogs represent is really inspiring to me, but they're also really important. So frogs are considered to be indicator species for their environments. So they are kind of canaries in the coal mines because they're so sensitive and they breathe through their skin. And so if there's something wrong with the water supply, you oftentimes see a bunch of frogs being affected first. And so they're really important for human systems as well. Next. So I mainly work in Ecuador for my PhD, which is an incredible country. And this is a satellite image of one of the sites that I work at, Jamacuaque, which is on the coast. But this really could be anywhere in the tropics, because what you see in almost all of these systems is a patchy forest landscape, and that's surrounded by some sort of agriculture, whether it's pasture or cafe or coffee or pineapple or whatever is popular in that region. And I'm really interested in, as a conservation biologist, in expanding that agriculture to be inclusive and kind of connecting these different habitats. But to do so, we have to figure out why we only find a subset of species, in this case frogs, in agriculture compared to the forest environments. And so that's what drives me, next please, to this really classic question in ecology, which is, why are species found where they are? Darwin asked this back in the 1800s, and really the answer lies in this interplay between natural history traits and the environment. So this is a really cool frog species. This is a dart frog, and what you see on the back there are tadpoles actually, and a lot of species will carry their tadpoles on their back and deposit tadpoles in these little water pools that accumulate in bromeliads, a type of plant. And so they wouldn't be able to do this without the environment that creates these little ponds, for lack of a better word. But on the other hand, they wouldn't need to do that if there wasn't so much competition in their environment to find other places to put their tadpoles besides streams. And so it's always this push and pull between evolution and the environment. Next, please. So in my PhD, I'm looking at a slew of natural history factors and environmental factors to try to get at this question on why we find species, some species in the forest, some of those species in agriculture, and some species only in agriculture, actually. But the part that I want to really talk to you about is vocalizations, because it's really exciting to me. And it kind of, it flips a lot of concepts on its head, which I always find inspiring in science. So next, please. So vocalizations or calls are really important for frogs. Males call to attract females, and if they can't hear each other, then they don't mate, and then then their populations will crash. And so you can imagine that, it's really basically of the utmost importance for male frogs to be heard. And if you remember from physics, sound is basically just the displacement of particles in a particular pattern. So you can kind of imagine these little particles later on when I'm talking about acoustic space. And this is how we represent sound in 2D space. But the main components we really want to pay attention to are frequency or pitch. And so this particular frog is like chick, chick. It has a really high pitched call compared to a lot of other frogs that you might be familiar with. Next, please. So I've been really interested in how sound influences where we find these different species. And so in a natural system along a stream, you can imagine you find a lot of different frogs. And what I've found is that they tend to stratify by sound. So what that means is that by waterfalls that are really loud, kind of has this white noise, that kind of shh kind of sound, the frogs that have higher frequencies tend to be closer to those areas because those pitches can actually move above those lower frequency white noise sounds, and their calls tend to have shorter syllables. Whereas if you go downstream, you can see that the frogs generally have lower frequency calls and their syllables or notes are longer, which is pretty neat. It's a neat pattern. Next, please. And so this brings us to this concept of acoustic space. So you might think about acoustic space as a cathedral or maybe a concert hall, but you can also think about acoustic space in the context of the environment. I mean, there's an acoustic space in whatever room you're in right now, and it's basically just how the physical environment is impacting those little particles you saw from that frog call, right? And any sound that's being made in nature. And so I'm tying that concept to conservation by asking about the different acoustic spaces in these different environments. And I have a hunch or a hypothesis that the acoustic space in these agricultural areas are actually not close enough to their natural environments. And that's what's stopping them from hearing each other. Next, please. And so this is in part because of how sound behaves. So you have, this is just a few examples, there are many more I could give, but you can imagine that short notes travel better in open environments because there's not a lot of obstruction, and longer notes travel well in dense vegetation. And similarly, higher frequencies degrade or attenuate faster, whereas lower frequency sounds like an elephant rumble, if you've ever seen a nature documentary, those are really low frequency, long waves. And they can travel through the ground, they can move around trees actually physically. So you can hear them much farther away than that little glass frog that has a high frequency call. It attenuates really quickly. Next, please. And so when you think about sound behaving, I am basically doing what a lot of sound engineers do in these classic human spaces like cathedrals, and doing an experiment to actually define those acoustic spaces outside. And so I'm using speakers and a microphone setup. I actually brought one here. They're really tiny, which is great, open source technology. It's basically like a computer chip board. And I'm putting these microphones at different distances and heights and playing these frequency sweeps to kind of see how different frequencies and volumes interact in this environment, and then comparing them to the frog calls that we find in those environments. Next, please. And so you can see here, I'm comparing all these different habitat types: primary forest, secondary forest, agroforest, or cacao or coffee. And we call it agroforest because it has a canopy cover still. And then high disturbance areas like these pastures for cows or other livestock. And I'm comparing what I'm finding in these experiments to the actual frog calls that you find in those environments. And you can see that it's a pretty clear pattern where the lower frequency calls are pretty much found in more high disturbance areas than primary forest, where you basically only find frogs that have really high pitched calls. And of course, this is only with a subset of species, but this is the general idea. And so, and I'm hoping to find out the sort of acoustic space sweet spots so that we can expand the agriculture habitat potential for a lot of these species, not just frogs, but birds and other animals that rely on communication to survive. So next, please. The next slide is just a picture of some of the amazing women that I work with. And I am really passionate about bringing along women at every step of the way. So I like to interact with and invite all the little kids, especially little girls in whatever villages I'm working in. It's really inspiring to me, like Lorena, who's on the far left here. When I first met her, she told me she thought frogs were gross. But then over time, she was so curious about what we were doing that she would always pay attention. And then after about a week, she was catching frogs and then releasing them after we had taken our measurements. And so those kind of stories are really inspiring. And I've just worked with so many different women over the years, and I really hope to continue empowering them and being inspired by them. So, and next, please. And lastly, I just wanted to come back to my mom and to say that I didn't mean to, but I actually discovered a new glass frog species this year, which is really exciting. And so I'm in the process of describing it with some of my colleagues, and I'm hoping to name it after my mom. Her name is Linda, which is really great because that means beautiful in Spanish. And so I think that really works well. And so I'm honoring my mom, who actually was able to visit me in Ecuador during my field season last year and see the place that I love so much. And so I love that it's kind of come full circle, and I owe her everything. So, and with that, thank you so much for listening. And I can't wait to hear the other talks. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have always been very interested in frogs as an indicator species, and I just want to tell you that I think it's wonderful that you found this species of frog, and it's wonderful that you're going to be able to name it after your mother, because it is truly a lovely little frog.
Yeah, it's very cute. It looks like it has glasses on, just like my mom too. So.
Yeah. Okay, our next speaker today will be Amy Campos. Amy is an American Fellow. Her institution is the University of San Diego. Her discipline is history, and her specialization is PhD in Latin America. In her work, Amy Campos explores the dynamics of frontier settlement in southern Chile during the late 19th century. Using national, regional, and local archival sources as a foundation, her research traces how the Chilean state, represented by engineers and government bureaucrats, developed and enacted its vision of economic progress through land redistribution projects. Her goal is to publish her research in an academic journal and begin work on a book manuscript. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank the organizers for all the seen and unseen labor that they did putting this together. Given that, this is kind of a women's conference, I want to go ahead and really acknowledge the work of our frontline healthcare workers. My mom is one of them, so I want to go ahead and acknowledge that. So my dissertation is a study of state formation processes along the Chilean southern frontier of the Araucanía in the late 19th century. So using a variety of archival sources, including government documents, correspondence from settlers, and maps, I look at how the Chilean state enacted its visions largely economic, of progress in a peripheral zone that until the 19th century was largely inhabited by the Mapuche indigenous community. The Chilean government gained military control of this region after a 3-year war that ended in 1883 and began mapping projects in order to prepare parcels to sell at auctions and also to entice European migration. Chilean government officials believed that through European colonization, this fertile southern region could form the breadbasket of the country. Europeans in particular were seen as agriculturally advanced in their farming technologies. My dissertation explores the dynamics of colonization through the perspective of engineers working for the Chilean government, European and Chilean settlers, as well as indigenous peoples who fought to retain their lands and with them, their way of life. While conducting research in Chilean archives, I was guided by 3 main questions. What kinds of knowledge did the cartographic processes of mapping and commodifying land in the region include and obscure? What role did bureaucrats and the local population play in the collection and creation of this information? And how did this information impact relationships between peasants and the land, and by extension, the state? How was land use in the Araucanía affected by its integration into the wider national and global market? My dissertation argues that the processes of mapping, the creating and the selling of indigenous lands, as well as the creation of repressive bureaucratic systems, were all a form of prolonged violence in the frontier that extended beyond the military campaign that ended in 1883. Much of the historical literature in my field has focused on the military and physical violence that came with indigenous displacement, as many were either forced to live in reduced plots or lost their land altogether. Chilean historians and anthropologists have primarily focused on the racial discourses behind the colonization process, as well as narratives of indigenous resistance in order to understand the relationship between Mapuche peoples and the state today, as well as laws that target Mapuche activism in the region. Like many of my Chileanist colleagues, I think we can learn a lot about indigenous state relations in the region through a study of these historical processes. While in the archives in the Araucanía on a Fulbright grant, I realized that many indigenous communities today who were still petitioning to regain their lost lands were navigating complex bureaucratic processes and using maps created by state engineers in the 19th century to make their land claims, as these maps seem to have an inherent, quote unquote, objective legitimacy. It was then that I realized in order to understand how the relationship between the state, people, and land today, we needed to look at the people who were considered the quote unquote gatekeepers, the people on the ground who decided how land was drawn and who got to keep it. So that was a bit about my kind of dissertation and what I was trying to do. And I think that even though my research, we're talking about a very particular space in Chile, I think that especially in the US, this story might sound familiar to us. If you went to school here, you may have heard stories about the US West and this narrative of progress, 19th century expansion from sea to shining sea, romanticized ideas like Little House on the Prairie, kind of these frontier families. But there's another side to that story. And there's a side about indigenous displacement. There's a side about having these indigenous communities forcibly removed, placed in reservations. And I kind of want to draw a parallel here because the Chilean government was looking at what the US government was doing, and they were just actively taking notes. And they looked at what they were doing to indigenous communities and they thought, hey, this seems like a great idea. We should do this too. So while the story of the Chilean government and the Mapuche is very confined to that space, it is a story of indigenous displacement that we also see in other parts of Latin America. So we see it happen in Argentina, where there was actually a war of extermination against their indigenous communities. We see it happen in Brazil, and we also saw it happen in the United States and in Mexico. So this is part of what I'm trying to do with my dissertation while I'm a Chileanist, and I am very much interested in processes happening in Chile. I do want to draw sort of these wider global connections to what's happening to other indigenous communities in the region. So this is part of what I try to do in my dissertation work. And having this AAUW fellowship has allowed me to not only go through the thousands of documents that you have to go through to get at these stories that are so rich and complex, but it has also allowed me to have the space to craft this very complex narrative and to attempt to really understand and access certain perspectives that are very difficult to access. So when we try to access the Mapuche perspective, for example, they're an oral culture and they didn't write a lot down. So trying to understand how they viewed land, how they understood private land ownership requires one to sit through thousands and thousands of documents, legal documents, land surveys and things like that to see how they defended their own rights to the land. So this is what I'm working on right now as I finish my dissertation, and I'm very grateful to have the resources and now the time to complete my dissertation work. So with that, I want to wrap up and thank the donors so much for what they did for us. And yeah, I'm very grateful and I look forward to hearing the other projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That's very interesting. Something reminding us that people are always looking at the United States. And that's been happening. You don't think that it happened way back, but it did. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, and good luck on your book. So we'll be waiting for that. So thank you, Amy. And next I would like to introduce Constance Eo. And Constance is an American fellow, and she is studying at the University of California at Irvine. Her discipline is education, and her specialization and degree, she's getting a postdoctoral, and her specialization is anthropology. She's an anthropologist of education, known for her cutting-edge research and conceptual frameworks that advance understanding of educational inequities, institutional culture, and social contacts. One of her recent contributions includes the model of college-going decisions and trajectories. She has shared her expertise with NBC Universal, Telemundo, and Michelle Obama's Reach Higher campaign, to name a few. Constance is one of the few academics ever named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. So welcome, Constance. We're really happy you're with us today.
Thank you so much. You can, next slide. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I feel so privileged and blessed to be sharing my work with you today, particularly exploring the college-going decisions and trajectories of low-income single mothers of color. And I just want to say thank you to AAUW, all that comprise this beautiful community, the funders, the organizers, and the many women that just make up this space. So thank you to you all. And I think this will be, this will be lit. So next slide. So you guys will see quickly that I am an access and opportunity scholar. So I believe in, sharing and bridging and building out the work beyond the spaces they're contained in. So you guys are welcome to follow me on Twitter, follow along on Twitter. Yeah, next. So when asked about my work broadly, I tend to tell people that I explore educational inequities, this idea of access and opportunity in the post-secondary education space, and really just what that sort of means and is facilitated across the P through 20 educational pipeline. Next. But specifically, my work looks at the sort of educational narratives that are hidden in plain sight. So who is the 21st century college student of today? How are they minoritized and marginalized in the space of post-secondary education? And what do their college going narratives look like? So this tends to look like me studying low-income students, students of color, students that have these sort of like post-traditional trajectories in higher education that really haven't been dealt with and sort of reconciled as we think of college going currently. Next. And as I think about sort of access in general, I find that a lot of these narratives have been sort of written out of the literature, policy, and even practice, so much so that, you know, even though as we might think of traditional students and the different options they have for college going. Next. I actually find that when we think about access and options for heavily minoritized, marginalized, and underrepresented communities, we're actually talking about the illusion of access, the illusion of opportunity, and really essentially the illusion of choice. Next. So specifically, I've challenged the concept of choice. I'm sort of sad looking at this photo because I no longer have those glasses, but you know, we persist, we must go on. Next. So the framework I use for this project and sort of how I see college going is this model I created that comprises the dimensions of information, time, and opportunity. And when you sort of put those dimensions together, ecologically, you can arrive at a better understanding or an understanding of any particular college decision and trajectory. And specifically, what's important about this model is that it doesn't work from a place of choice that sort of privileges certain narratives that may have options or may have lots of information about college or a myriad of different opportunities, or the time in their life is really privileged towards college going. So what does that all mean for this study I'm looking at? Next. I want to understand the information, opportunity, and time context that informs the college going decisions and trajectories of low-income single mothers of color. And this group is really important because within 6 years, only 8% of single mothers will either have an associate's or bachelor's degree. We're also talking a population in which 90% of single mothers are low income and disproportionately women of color, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and also Asian. So a really special population. Next. So I want to talk to you guys just quickly about Sharon, whose narrative I wanted to pull out for the purposes of our conversation today. Next. So she's a 33-year-old Filipina single mother. She lives below the poverty level. She's attended 3 different colleges, one being a 4-year and 2 being community colleges. Next. So really big for the sort of comments I'm about to share, she sort of likened the sort of symbolism she has around higher education as a very particular picture. So she likens higher education really to a deadbeat or absentee father. Next. It hit me, and this really resonates because I'm a single mother. Each college I've been to is its own kind of deadbeat father. Society has an idea about what fathers should be. The world has an idea about what college should be. But at so many points, that protection, that opportunity, that guidance, it failed me. I'm honestly nervous to give any other place a try. Next. When I was at my first community college, it was just rough. There was really no kind of compassion or organization. I'm older and working and providing for a kid. Then I have to go to a school where you have to talk to 8 people to get one answer. Next. It was here when I was dealing with domestic violence. And for me, this hurt because I'm not asking college to be Superman. I asked for specific resources. I mean, I get it, but then I don't. With all the book smarts colleges have, they should know these situations are dire. Next. When I was in a 4-year institution, I just sensed they could do something, but it just didn't. It would be too much of an inconvenience. Someone told me, Well, if we provide this for you, then we have to do it for others. And in my head, I trusted you and believed the hype. Like, can I get a used book? Next. There was that other community college. You get to school, then you get a parking ticket because you are late and just need to park somewhere to get to class on time because you had to drop off your kid. I ended up nearly dropping this school because I missed so much class. Next. So really just sort of situating the fact that even things coming down to parking are structural barriers. Next. And just lastly, then I couldn't continue because my financial aid and credits didn't align. I went to get everything settled, but they were withholding financial aid because of a technicality. It just made no sense. I told the lady I just need a break, no help. So many of us have these effed up college stories and leave college and are terrified to come back. Next. So why is this work so important? Well, a number of reasons, as you have probably surmised, but how do we go beyond the performative to actually creating empathic and sophisticated solutions in the policy practice and conceptual realm to really just better recognize and support the heterogeneous population in higher education? Next. So again, I look forward to continuing forward with this model and this study so that these narratives that are problematically hidden in plain sight can be appropriately addressed. Next. So I just wanted to say thank you to you all for going on this journey with me. I try to match my PowerPoint to my hair, as you guys can see at this point. Really excited about this work. Next. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Feel free to contact me via my website, follow me on Twitter, or just send me an email. But I would love to stay connected. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Constance. It's really difficult if you haven't been in a situation like that to realize what all the obstacles are, or that there are any obstacles to begin with. So your work is very important, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Now we have Lisette Solorzano, and please forgive me if I pronounced that improperly. She's an American Fellow. Her institution is University of Southern California. Her location is Los Angeles. Her discipline is sociology, and her specialization and degree is PhD in immigration and immigrant integration, Latino immigrant youth. Her project name, DACA, Status, Precarity, and the Incorporation Experiences of Latino DACA recipients in Los Angeles before and during the Trump era. Lisette's research on immigrant integration has explored semi-legal precarities of the deferred DACA, of DAPA and DACA. Her current dissertation research exposes the vulnerabilities, activist work, and healing agencies of Los Angeles-based DACA beneficiaries in anti-immigrant times. Her long-term goals are to become a tenure-track professor and continue serving her community via a combination of faith-rooted immigrant rights organized and empirical research. Thank you for being with us this morning, Lisette.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. But before I start any of my research and sharing that, I really wanted to say thank you to the AAUW. This fellowship is funding the last year of my dissertation, so all the writing. I'm also a first-time mother, and my baby is now a very wild and vivacious toddler. So the fellowship is helping me to focus on my writing while being a mother during a pandemic. So I'm just really deeply grateful for this fellowship and to the AAUW. So to begin, I want to share how I became involved with this research. My research is with Latino immigrant communities in the United States. And really my research derives from the personal sensibilities I feel that stem from having grown up with Mexican immigrant parents and myself having experienced migrations with them, my parents and my siblings across Mexico and the US. We were born in California, actually, but we were raised across countries in these migrations. And on the slide, as you'll see, I have some pictures of our home back in Mexico. It is Jalisco, the state of Jalisco. And the folks there on the picture are my grandparents. My grandfather, actually both my grandfathers from my maternal and paternal side, were both migrants to the US since the 1960s. So my family has a lot of experience, some very difficult, of migration. And it's these that really do shape the way that I see the world and the way that I see immigrants. Now, to go back to some of my own migration experience, a lot of these migration experiences happen in my formative years. So between the ages of 6 and the ages of 14. And it was really, really impactful for me. Migration is very difficult. It's very, very, very difficult for a number of reasons and in a number of levels: economic, familial, emotional, psychological. And families and individuals do it because they have faith. They have faith that there's something better on the other side, whether they're escaping poverty or violence or personal circumstances. They embark on these migration experiences, these migration trips to the United States. And the thing is that it doesn't end there. After migrating and beginning to settle in your new home, in a new country, there's the work of integrating into the new country. So it is there that my research really is found. It's an immigrant integration and an immigrant integration experiences. And my research is specific in that I look at undocumented immigrant integration experiences and what are the barriers preventing integration and also the well-being of immigrants and their families in this country. So now, I want to talk about federal context because it's really important when it comes to my research area. Federal context is key for immigrant integration nationwide. And that's because it determines if and how immigrants attain legal status. And a federal legal status is basically one of the most important things for integration. Without it, immigrants are pushed to margins. It was in 1986 during the Reagan's presidency, actually, that the last federal immigration comprehensive reform happened in this country. That reform gave legal status to undocumented immigrants, including my father. So that amnesty helped my father tremendously and my family tremendously to this day. It gave my parents' efforts and their hopes a home in this country. Currently, there are 77% of immigrants in this country. They're here legally, but almost a quarter of immigrants are undocumented. We currently have an undocumented population of approximately 10.5 million, and 66% of these have been in the country for over a decade with no relief in sight in a very divided Congress. And these numbers are from the Pew Research Center. Now, many undocumented are youth. They're undocumented youth and young adults who have been in the country since obviously very, very young. They've grown up in the country. This is permanent home. And as they grow in income of age, they're experiencing a number of barriers in higher education access, higher education completion, occupational mobility, healthcare access. So there's a lot of challenges that come with lacking a legal status. Relief did come to the undocumented young adults in 2012, but it came via a very strong activist push from undocumented youth organizers and activists. But basically, this relief was the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. And you might hear DACA on the news or in school. DACA is what we call this relief. DACA really has been shown to provide many benefits from access to well-paying jobs, occupational mobility, and access to higher education. It made a really big difference. Now, the thing about DACA is that DACA is not a federal legal status. It is a work permit and a temporary protection from deportation. It derived administratively in 2012 via the Obama administration, but DACA was always subject to a new administration, shifts by a new administration, especially if the administration wasn't friendly or wasn't welcoming of immigrants. So really temporary DACA, precarious DACA are the descriptors here for describing this program, this DACA program. And in fact, the current administration, I think, really demonstrates this. Precarity and worst case scenario for precarity happened in 2017 during the Trump administration decision to cancel DACA. And DACA has since never really been on solid ground. It was never, but it really hasn't anymore. DACA has been in and out of litigation since 2017. It went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2020, just recently. And along the way, folks with this status are being taken on a roller coaster, thinking about what their life might be like without DACA. Their status is precarious. Life will be very different without it. At the time of the rescission, DACA rescission or DACA cancellation in 2017, nearly 800,000 DACA recipients were affected by this. On to the next slide, please. Okay, so there, in that picture are pictures of Washington, D.C. At the time of DACA rescission, I was a graduate intern in an immigrant rights organization in Los Angeles. We were learning community organizing, but specifically we were learning community organizing for immigrant rights. Now, because of DACA's cancellation, my colleagues and I went to Washington, D.C. to advocate. There were many cohorts to DC through this organization. Mine was one of nearly a dozen. But we were there doing legislative visits, and you can see in the picture we met with Jamie Gomez. We were doing activist actions, some civil disobedience, and we were doing prayer as well, because faith is a big aspect of some immigrants' incorporation and migration experiences. So we were doing all of these things in Washington, D.C. to save DACA. At the same time, we were also pushing for the Federal DREAM Act. Now, the Federal DREAM Act is different because it would award a pathway to permanent legal status and citizenship to young people. We currently don't have it. We don't have the DREAM Act. We're still fighting for it. Now it's in a new version, the Promise Act. On to the next slide, please. Now I want to talk about my dissertation. My dissertation really is grounded in a lot of these efforts that I just spoke about, and in a lot of these sensibilities that come with my experience as a migrant child. And so my dissertation basically examines what I just described as DACA precarity. I looked at the ways that DACA precarity shapes the lived experiences of DACA beneficiaries in Los Angeles specifically. I look at their sense of belonging, their political engagement, and their health, and the ways that these have been affected as a result of having a very unstable status. I do this via qualitative methodology so that I can provide depth. I really want to expose people's real life stories, young immigrants' real life stories. So very quickly, some of my findings is I really do find a lot of uncertainty, and this uncertainty does shape political engagement for inclusion. They want to claim a legal inclusion and a substantive sense of belonging in this country, because that belonging has been deeply challenged. Now, the part that I'm currently working on is the emotional and psychological effects of precarity. I'm writing a brief, and I wrote a short essay with a young activist on some of the effects, the health effects from anxiety to fear, depression that come with just not knowing what's going to happen in the future, especially for them in the future without a legal status. So this is data I'm currently unpacking. Now, I want to end with saying that I really hope that my efforts really go towards passing comprehensive immigration reform for undocumented immigrant communities. According to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services data, the majority of DACA beneficiaries, 54% as of 2017 data, are girls and young women. So I feel that comprehensive immigration reform has a gendered aspect, a gendered legal benefit. And that's it. I just want to say thank you again before I end very much to the AAUW, and thank you for your support in my research.
Thank you, Lisette.
Thank you.
I love all the applause we're getting from the audience. Thank you, Lisette. Important work you're doing. So our best to you. So hope it all works out, but thank you very much. And now next we're going to move to our international fellows. And we have 3 international fellows that will be speaking today. And Rochelle McPhee is the first one. She just arrived in the last 3 or 4 weeks in the United States from Jamaica. And we're really happy that she was able to get to the United States before we had this virtual luncheon. So she's studying at the University of California in San Diego. Her discipline is social sciences, and she's working on a PhD in ethnic studies. In her research, Rochelle is bringing structural analysis to bear on systems of power, social discourses, and historical conditions that shape the eligibility or ineligibility of sexualized violence, particularly against queer women in Jamaica. She co-founded We Change in 2015 and the Tambourine Army in 2016. The former is a women-led organization focused on increasing the number of LGBT women participating in social justice advocacy. And the latter is a movement organized around eliminating the scourge of sexual violence against women and children. We're really glad you could be with us today, Rochelle. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. So again, I'm Rochelle McPhee, and I'm an international student from Jamaica. And I also just want to echo the sentiments of everyone else who's saying thank you to AAUW for the support. So the work that I will be talking about today is my attempt to bring together my personal experiences as a survivor of sexual violence and my background in gender policy and advocacy and community mobilization, movement building, legislative review, and monitoring and evaluation in the service of creating the kind of feminist future I think we all desire. Next slide. So the intellectual and political questions in my research are shaped by these experiences as a publicly out lesbian in Jamaica, and as someone who was doing work in the area of sexual violence, who until my own interaction with the justice system hadn't considered some of the ways we as a movement might reproduce harm in our own interventions. So I guess just as a little background, in 2016, a Moravian minister was arrested for having sex with an underage girl. And there was much public outcry, but there was also a way that the church body attempted to construct this as an anomaly. And given my own experience with the same church as a child, I made the decision to disclose my assault at the hands of 2 ministers, first to a group of women who I'd worked alongside with in the movement, and then in a letter to the head of the church detailing my assault and calling for an investigation. And then we arranged a march, a protest at the church, and a series of events unfolded that led to the birth of the Tambourine Army, a radical feminist organization, and an online movement, Say Their Names, which named perpetrators of sexual violence, the arrest of the leader of our army. And I eventually made a formal report of my own assault, which led to the arrest and charge of the ministers in my case. But I was also deeply troubled by how the stories circulated, my story and the story of the young girl. So for months, it was framed as the Moravian sex scandal. And, while our work and our agitation had sparked, this national conversation and pressured the government to centralize sexual violence as a national issue and mobilize this growing community of Black queer women, I feel like extreme measures were also being taken to shield the perpetrators of violence from accountability while creating villains of the people who were being violated and the persons who were also advocating for justice. So the men who were charged, were allowed to, bring themselves in. They were given bail on the same day for $300,000, while Latoya Nugent, who was the head of our army, she was, her home was invaded by rifle-bearing police officers from a major organized crime unit. She was arrested, denied medical attention. She was in a hospital and was still in police custody. And then she was eventually bailed for $1 million and sued for $16 million. And then there was also like the way the media was ostracizing the child's working class family and suggesting that they were to be blamed for the violence she had experienced. And in my case, I was being purged of my sickness because I was gay. And then my sexuality was also being mobilized as the reason a jury wouldn't find me a sympathetic survivor. So all of these things kind of came together to frame some of the questions I'm asking in my project. And I interrogate, the structures of power and the social discourses and the historical conditions that shape how people are legible or easily read as survivors or victims, however you want to frame it, of violence. And I ask, how is this illegibility structured by how our Blackness intersects with our femaleness and our queerness in the aftermath of chattel slavery and colonization in a predominantly Black nation, such that our bodies are available to violation at the hands of anyone, including other Black hands. And I do this predominantly by looking at, next slide, please, by looking at laws and policies and juridical practices that shape the illegibility, essentially what registers as violence. And I also look at practices for witness preparation and cross-examination that require re-traumatizing recounting of violence. So for example, one of the things that I've done is look, for example, at the Sexual Offenses Act, which misclassifies rape of minors as sex with a person under the age of 16. And it defines sexual intercourse through a heteronormative paradigm of vaginal penile penetration, which in effect limits what is classified as rape. And it doesn't allow those deemed under the law, particularly transgender women, from claiming rape. So here we see language being deployed to explicitly and implicitly discriminate against minority groups. And it limits the access of young and queer persons in particular to redress. And then next slide. My next question is, how is this illegibility and structures of violence reproduced through narration? And here I'm looking at how violence is enacted discursively and yes, related to legislation, but specifically thinking about how the work that the media does to maintain and normalize violence. And in terms of the work that I've done toward answering this question, I wrote a paper called Language Matters and Problematizing the Classification of Rape of Minors as Sex with a Person under the age of 16. And here I essentially tracked all the times the media framed this particular case as a sex scandal. And I analyzed it alongside the comments that were left on the online publication using Horton Spiller's work to think about how Black female sexuality has been subject to a representational, or as she frames it, a pornotropic gaze that robs women and girls of complex subjectivity. And here I argued that it is through a linguistic and other representational codes that pornotroping produces meaning, and it disempowers, pathologizes, and reduces women and girls to the zone of the exotic or the erotic. And this representation helps to justify the sexual violence that women and girls experience. And I'm also arguing that the media practitioners can enact a refusal that more adequately and ethically narrate this violence. And my use of refusal is to say a political stance. And I'm thinking here with Audra Simpson's conceptual framework. That is a political stance that is against a deeply unequal scene of articulation that people are thrown into, and a deliberate and willful acting against what the colonial system demands of us. Next slide. And then lastly, and I think what is more central to my project is thinking about the possibilities for a sustainable Black queer feminist movement in Jamaica. So within a year of the Tambourines Army founding, I'd sort of distanced myself from the movement because of what I'm framing in my project as these fractures. And the distance came through a difficulty with reconciling my survivor activist position and a recognition that so much of what we ask for in our advocacy and activism can actually be quite harmful if we're not fully attentive to the individual needs of women who we're trying to support. So when we tell women to name their abusers and report violence, do we also have mechanisms to support their healing? You know, when we have to sit through rape kits and court hearings and have our stories widely circulated and adjudicated in the media and we're publicly shamed, do we have appropriate support mechanisms for that? You know, when we as survivors ask people in the movement to adjust, you know, their strategies of engagement, do we tell them, you know, it's not about you as an individual, we have to think about a bigger picture? Or are we adjusting in support of the individual, you know, who we need to be supporting? When we secure a conviction, you know, does our work stop there? So these are some of the conversations I'm trying to have. And just last week, a chapter that I wrote was published in the Routledge Handbook on the politics of the Me Too movement, where I'm trying to, you know, have these conversations about how these kinds of violences are reproduced in how we, you know, in our movement building spaces. And so this is also something I want to pay attention to in the third section of my dissertation project. And so the final thing that I'm really trying to do is to mobilize a chorus of survivors' voices to map what I'm calling a framework of thrivance and healing that we can utilize in our movement building spaces that can ethically respond to survivors. And I will not be asking, you know, survivors to revisit what Saidiya Hartman calls the scenes of subjection, to tell their stories of violation one more time. I'm more interested in what are the ways, you know, survivors have, whether individually or collectively, found ways to support each other that facilitate healing and thriving that has not necessarily depended on a colonial judicial system. And maybe that can help us to figure out other ways to reconceive our notions of, you know, justice, what justice wants and what justice looks like. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for your support. This year, I will take the time to, you know, figure out how to more appropriately have those conversations, especially in the pandemic time. That will be what I will be focusing on this year, having those conversations and mapping out what that framework can potentially look like. So thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Thank you for sharing your work with us, Rochelle. I cannot imagine what this has been like for yourself and other young women, and the work that you're doing is so important. Thank you for taking that on. Next up, we have Maria Jose Navarrete. Maria is an Ecuadorian citizen. She's studying at UC Berkeley. Her discipline is biology, and her degree of specialization, PhD in ecology and environment and evolution. Maria is a doctoral student in the integrative biology program at UC Berkeley. She is interested in elucidating the genetic and environmental mechanisms underlying the evolution of novel traits that characterize instances of phenotypic diversification and convergence, particularly in Andean ecosystems. Along with her professional aspirations, she is committed to protecting biological richness through science, empowering indigenous communities through conservation, and fostering gender equality in academia. Hello, Maria.
Hey, hi, Judy. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Navarrete, and I'm a first-year PhD student in ecology and evolution at UC Berkeley. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I am using this presentation, as you can see, as an opportunity to show you the beauty of my country, and also to share with you my passion for nature and conservation. I hope you enjoy this presentation as much as I enjoyed making it. Growing up in Ecuador, one of the Earth's biodiversity hotspots, observation became my primary source of learning. My inherent curiosity of the natural world developed quickly as I took refuge in nature from harsh childhood experiences. Nature became and still is my shelter. The world must not be a bad place if I get to share it with these beauties, right? Next slide, please. Later, through college and also as a research assistant, I gained extensive experience in fieldwork. I've been fortunate enough to work in many diverse habitats, which has allowed me a broad perspective on ecosystems and taught me always to consider natural history when thinking about more theoretical questions. Particularly, I fell in love with these amazing creatures, the amphibians, that luckily Becca already gave a wonderful explanation of their importance. Next slide, please. For my research, I want to link two of my passions, mountains and amphibians. I aim to elucidate patterns of amphibian diversification associated with main geographic events, such as the race of the Andes. The formation of a mountain range, called orogeny, represents the origin of geographic barriers that favored ecological speciation, and also contributed for the creation of new habitats that also contributed for ecological speciation. I decided to work with the most diverse genus of vertebrates, the Pristimantis frogs, to elucidate this pattern and to answer this question. Here we can see some preliminary results, color-coded from red being lowland to blue being paramo, is the altitude of the environment where these frogs are inhabiting, and also the ancestral reconstruction of their habitats. The gray lines that you can see there represent the major orogenetic events of Andean uplift. We can see the time also at the down of the figure represented there. Surprisingly, the estimations show that most of the colonization events of high altitude environments, over 10,000 feet above sea level, coincide with the last major orogenetic events in the early Pliocene, that is around 2 million years ago, supporting with biological evidence that the Andes are not as old as we thought, and providing a new line of evidence for solving the discrepancies around paleo-altitude estimations of the Andes. Here at the top of the figure, we can see the estimation for the speciation rate. If we take a close look at the speciation curve, we can notice that it proceeds at a steady rate, suggesting that although Andes favored speciation in amphibians, their effect on this group, on the speciation of this group, is actually overrated. Also, my work showed that in spite of all of the taxonomic efforts, the Pristimantis genus is still full of undescribed species. In fact, during this work, I described 2 new species of Pristimantis. One of them is the species, the image that we can see here, and many more are coming. Next slide, please. Currently, I'm also interested in studying the evolution of chemical defenses in amphibians. Some of you might have seen these cuties around ponds in California. I actually found these newts in Mount Madonna near Gilroy. So these newts are known for being super toxic, bearing a neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin that blocks the normal function of neurons, producing paralysis in animals that ingest them. The interesting thing is that contrary to other amphibians that either produce their toxin or that sequester it from their diet, the tetrodotoxin is actually produced by symbiotic bacteria that live in the skin glands of these newts. Even more surprising is that the same toxic compound has been reported from these frogs that we can see here of the genus Atelopus that are distributed from Central America to Bolivia. So I'm currently developing a project to study the origin of this toxin in this group of frogs and to identify similarities in the bacteria strains between newts from California and frogs from South America. Next slide, please. However, something that I was not prepared for to face was this, what we are seeing in this image. Going from beauty, diversity, life, to chaos, deforestation, and death. Yet, it is happening as we speak. While the world was in pause because of COVID, the destruction never stopped. The waterfall that you can see here is the waterfall of San Rafael, the largest one in Ecuador. And it died this year because of a poorly designed dam. Logging, mining, unsustainable agriculture, exploitation, and pet trade are among the most dangerous practices for the maintenance of biodiversity, and therefore for our own lives and well-being. Ecuador, a small yet strikingly species-rich country, is facing an unprecedented habitat degradation that urgently needs scientists studying species, communities, and ecosystems under as many as possible perspectives. So thank you, Becca, for your work. I see conservation, next slide, please. Well, so I see conservation and education as my duties and responsibilities with society. My pursuit of a scientific career and conservation efforts are highly motivated by a dedication to fostering a more inclusive and unbiased environment for the promotion and professional development of women and Black and Indigenous communities. That is why I co-founded this organization called Her Nature, that aims to protect the forest and foster sustainable livelihoods through empowering women. Our first project is taking place in the coastal fishing village of Mompiche. Here we can see one of the girls from the town holding her first snake. She was super excited. At the beginning, she was being mocked by the boys because she didn't want to do it, but at the end, she took courage and she did it, and she was extremely happy. Next slide, please. Furthermore, my lab and I are in this constant campaign that seeks to encourage scientists to translate their research to the local language. This helps to outreach to local communities for political and environmental decisions, and also makes knowledge more democratic and accessible to non-English speaking communities. While having a common scientific language is important, we are responsible for crossing language barriers and making transformative progress in science, maintaining research ethics and ensuring that our scientific community reflect our societal diversity. Next slide, please. Luckily, I've joined the best lab to develop my ideas and my scientific interests. I met Rebecca Tarbin here talking to this guide, and also in the middle of the picture here with like the girls while doing field work. And she treated everybody with respect and always encouraged local people, especially women, as you can see in one of the pictures, to foster a career in academia. Becca is not only an amazing scientist, but also a wonderful human being. Next slide, please. That said, it is important for me to acknowledge that who I am and my being here is due to the support from many amazing, strong women that would like to join their voices to mine for thanking you, AAUW, for giving me this lifetime opportunity. Especially, I would like to bring, next slide, please. And next slide, please. Especially, I would like to bring my grandma's voice to this presentation. She's one of the most intelligent women I've ever met, and a frustrated scientist. As a result of poverty and machismo, she couldn't even finish elementary school. However, she worked hard, and in 2 generations, here I am. When I think about her, this phrase comes to my mind. Utopia lies at the horizon. When I draw nearer by 2 steps, it retreats 2 steps. If I proceed 10 steps forward, it swiftly slips 10 steps ahead. No matter how far I go, I can never reach it. What then is the purpose of utopia? it is to cause us to advance. What we do now can have an impact in the future. Let's make the most out of our time here. From her and I, our eternal gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear all this important work going on, and really, really appreciate the work you're doing with young people. That's so important. So thank you very much, Maria, for being here today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our last international fellow, and this is Yvonne Zhang. She is studying at the American Film Institute Conservatory in Los Angeles, and she's from the United Kingdom. Her discipline is film, of course, and she is specializing in getting a degree in directing. She's a filmmaker with a focus on magical, realist stories that center dysphoria communities and explore identity, belonging, and power. She holds a foundation in fine art from Central St. Martin's School of Art and Design and a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Edinburgh. She's currently a directing fellow at the American Film Institute Conservatory with support from AAUW, Fulbright, BAFTA Los Angeles, and PEO International. So please help me welcome Yvonne.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here and to be part of such an inspiring cohort of women. It's very nourishing, so thank you. So, as you know, I'm a British Chinese filmmaker. I'm Yvonne Zhang. I'm currently training as a directing fellow at the American Film Institute here in Los Angeles, California. When I first visited China in 2000, my grandfather sat me down and gave me my first ever big life talk. At the time, I guessed he must have been telling me something about integrity or how to be good or how to survive in this world. But my Mandarin was so limited that I only understood a few words. I couldn't tell him that the wisdom he was taking the time to pass on to me was falling on deaf ears. I didn't want to be a disappointment. Eventually, though I couldn't understand my family's words, I learned to read everything else. I read their tone, I read their physical gestures, the chopsticks dance at the dinner table as we fought to put food in each other's bowls. I found solace in these expressions of love and care that were unspoken. I've always been drawn to filmmaking for its ability to communicate meaning in ways that transcend words. At AFI, this is something we've learned to call the subtext of a movie. That's what is happening beneath what people say. And this is what directors need to master. But I realized that I've been doing this since that very first talk with my grandfather at the age of 8. Whatever words he was using, I knew that what he really meant was, I care about you. Next slide, please. The path to directing isn't an easy one. I grew up in one of the lowest income areas in London in the UK. My mum was a single working mother, and I spent a lot of my time being looked after by my childminder's small TV. However, I never realized that there were actually people behind these stories that me and the other kids consumed. It was only when I was 14, when I attended this free youth program that my friend told me about in filmmaking, that I realized what went into their creation. When I eventually started creating my own work, it was always limited severely by a lack of resources, community, and crew, which meant that it was also limited in its ambition, scope, and reach. The major problem with directing is that even if you can make your way into the lowest levels of the industry, which is a big enough challenge, there isn't a clear career path for directing specifically. It's a kind of catch-22. You have to already be a director or have experience as a professional director in order to do work as one. Yeah, doesn't make any sense. Because of how inaccessible it is, you end up with statistics like this one here. Across 1,000 films studied between 2007 and 2016, only 4% of them were directed by women. And if we look at the next slide, of the 1,114 directors that worked, there were only 3 Asian female directors. So I knew I needed to train and to stand a fighting chance. And being able to train at AFI's MFA program has been an absolute dream come true. Next slide, please. AFI is unique in the way that it grounds its teachings in hands-on training and real-world production environments. In our first year, we work with fellows specializing in lots of different disciplines, cinematography, editing, screenwriting, producing, and production design, to create 3 to 4 short films. In doing so, we get to creatively experiment and grow from the critical feedback from our peers. Next slide, please. This is the first film that I made. It's about a retired couple battling eviction in their apartment in LA's Chinatown, and in doing so, rediscovering a sense of home in each other. Next slide. This is the second film I made in collaboration with an Asian American screenwriter. It's about 3 generations of Chinese American women dealing with their grandmother's dementia and finding hope in the present moments that they share with each other. I'm now entering into my second year at AFI. I'm working on a project about female sexuality, desire, and empowerment, and 2 visual poems about mother-daughter relationships. I'm also developing 2 screenplays for feature films, which I'm hoping to seek funding for upon graduating. This year, I'll also be writing and directing my thesis film, a story about a found family of immigrant women who run a motel, and a young girl who comes into her voice and power to protect and defend her community. I'm working with a team made up purely of women from all over the world, and I'm extremely excited. Next slide, please. As you can tell, AFI keeps us extremely busy. It's a very intense program, but it's taught me so much about the craft, as well as helps demystify the industry processes needed to build a career. But more than anything, I've found a community of collaborators and friends that I know I'll be working with for the years to come, which is truly priceless. Stories help us make sense of our lives. They also give us access to perspectives outside our own. They're vehicles of empathy, and they're writers of history. As a British Chinese child, I didn't have stories available to me that helped me make sense of my experience. And so my experience often felt marginal or completely invalid. As a filmmaker and a storyteller, I'm deeply committed to bringing empowered representations of women and people of color to the screen and tell stories that explore updated narratives surrounding migration, identity, belonging, and power. My aim is to work towards a better future for women and girls, both on screen and off. When I eventually return to the UK, one of my biggest goals is to create opportunities for young filmmakers. I feel extremely lucky, but I want to work towards a future where it doesn't feel like luck, where women and girls from any background can hold the power of telling their own stories. I have no words for the immense gratitude I feel towards the American Association for University Women for providing me with this support. With your help, I'm now able to follow my dream headfirst so that I might one day help open doors as they were opened for me. In a world that's mediated by screens and dominated by dangerously simplistic narratives, I want to champion on-screen stories that celebrate our differences as well as what unites us, opening us up to empathy and humanity beyond words. Thank you.
Thank you. Your work and your art sounds like you're going to do great things, and I look forward to seeing your future work. We are now moving on to our career development grants. First, we will be hearing from Claire Brining. Claire is studying at UC San Francisco. She's studying in health and medical sciences. Her aim is an MSN in Women's Health Nurse Practitioner, Nurse Midwife. Claire is pursuing an MS in nursing, specializing in nurse midwifery and women's health. After years of working as a full-time project manager in tech and as a part-time birth doula, she looks forward to dedicating herself fully to increasing access to midwifery care for underserved populations with the goal of reducing racial disparities in birth outcomes. Claire?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm so excited to talk with everybody today, and also for all of your support so far. And thank you for that great introduction. So I am in my first year of the program at UCSF, and last year I completed what's considered the MEPIN year, which is for people who have a degree that's not in nursing to become a licensed nurse. So I successfully completed that first year, and now I'm on to the master's portion. So today what I'd like to do is I wanted to just first talk a little bit about my decision to really pivot and change careers and go back to school. And then I wanted to take some time to talk about the midwifery model of care and how for me this is a response to the racial disparities in birth outcomes, and also the place that midwifery has in women's reproductive justice. And I also, before I start, I want to give credit to some of the amazing professors in my program for sharing with me some of the infographics and the information I'm going to share later here. So I had kind of a winding path to midwifery. As was already shared, I was working at the startup Stripe as a project manager for 4 years prior to going back to school. I'm originally from the Midwest, but I had the opportunity to complete high school and part of college living in Argentina. And it was in Argentina that I really became interested in the experience of what it means to be living in a country that's not native to you, the foreigner experience, and also immigration specifically. And when I came back to the US, for me, that really translated politically to an interest in politics and specifically immigration, and specifically women and children who are immigrants to the US from Spanish-speaking countries. So I graduated from college with a BA in political science, and I worked for a little bit at an immigration law firm as a bilingual immigration paralegal. But I found out after a bit that law is not for me, and that's when I transitioned to tech. So while I was working as a project manager, I needed an outlet for my political activism. And so I decided to take a training to become a volunteer birth doula. And that experience really opened my eyes and kind of ignited a lifelong passion for birth work. And I had a great opportunity to work with many immigrant and Spanish-speaking women at different hospitals in the Bay Area as a birth doula. And slowly, I came to the realization that this is important work that I want to continue doing for the rest of my life. And so then I decided to take the plunge, take a ton of prerequisites in math and science that I didn't have, and to go back to school to be a nurse midwife. So here I am. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take a chance to talk a little bit about the maternity care system in the US for those who are not that familiar with it. So there are many health resources in the US, but unfortunately, these are disproportionately and inappropriately distributed. So there's a really high and rising cost of maternity care, and there's a failure to implement evidence-based practice and a lack of midwives. And this leads to poor outcomes compared to countries with similar resources, and especially marked race-associated disparities, which especially affect Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. Next slide, please. So here you can see a graph that's showing the racial and ethnic disparities in pregnancy-related deaths. And although there's been a slight decrease over the last 10 years, you can see that Black and American Indian and Alaskan Native women continue to have higher rates of pregnancy-related deaths compared to other groups. Next slide, please. And this slide really illustrates that as well, that Indigenous and Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. And that's true even across states such as California, which are considered relatively low risk. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, and so what is the reason for this? The root cause really comes down to racism and at a structural level and also on a personal level with the providers. So racism that leads to bias and discrimination in the policies and practices that exist, that lead to differences in availability of types of insurance, that lead to differences in access of care for people. Next slide, please. So what is midwifery and how does this tie in? There are many different definitions of midwifery that can be found. One that I really like comes from the International Confederation of Midwives. And some of the key concepts include partnership with women to promote self-care and the health of mothers, infants, and families, respect for human dignity, advocacy for women, cultural sensitivity, and a focus on health promotion and disease prevention that views pregnancy as a normal life event. And for me, the midwifery model of care offers the opportunity to deliver high quality care to all women, which is especially important for POC women who disproportionately experience negative outcomes. Next slide, please. So here you can see this graph shows the midwife to obstetrician ratio in the US compared to other developed countries. And in the US, it's 1/8 of the median among this group at only 0.32%. Next slide, please. So my goals for the future, upon graduation, I would like to work as a nurse midwife at a California public hospital. And I'd like to really be the midwife that I wish that my doula clients had and work with especially Spanish speakers. And long term, I hope to open a nonprofit standalone birth center somewhere that currently doesn't offer this option for birthing families. And some of the goals of this birth center would be to offer a supportive, inclusive working environment for birth professionals who on the whole are women and who oftentimes do not receive the compensation that their skills and time are, or the value that their skills and time are worth. And also, I'm hoping to have a volunteer doula program associated with the birth center, such as the one that I participated in, so that women in the community can have access and exposure and perhaps gain an interest in healthcare, such as I did. And finally, to have this as a community resource for parents and for all who would like to be involved in the birth community. Last slide, please. So I just want to take a chance to thank everyone so much for the support that I've received. And as I continue to pursue my goal of becoming a nurse midwife, I'm really so honored to be able to talk here today with everyone. And I hope that very soon, within the next 2 years, I'll be able to start improving birth outcomes for those patients that I will serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire, for you've had an interesting career and many, many things. What a great background you have to go into this new venture. So best wishes as you go forward. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce another one of our career development grant recipients, and this is Feather Ives. She's studying at the University of Nevada in Reno, and her discipline is health and medical sciences. And she is specializing in public health. How appropriate is that at this time? She's transitioned to a career in science in 2016 through a STEM career education program at a community college. She's now a faculty member in that program and helps students build their STEM careers. She's earning this Master's of Public Health and is implementing a college food security resources program for the Richmond Promise. She seeks to improve health outcomes for college students by reducing inequities and ensuring access to basic needs. So take it away, Feather.
Thank you so much, everyone, for welcoming all of us today. And I am so grateful for this grant and it's supporting my work and acknowledging the importance of my work. I am, next slide would be great. Thank you. Please. So a little bit about my career journey, which is how I like to start most of my talks, is for 15 years, I was in sales and property management and a variety of wonderful non-science careers that really fed me and made me who I am today. But it wasn't what I always wanted to do. When I went to college, I did go to college to be a biology major, but back in the 90s, things weren't quite how they are now. And those of us who are first gen didn't necessarily have as many, it wasn't as evident, there wasn't as much support as, and from my experience, from my point of view, as there is today. And so I got off of that track. And so in 2016, I learned of a training program at Merritt College, where I am currently in right now with the mask on, so my students are working. And I was trained to become a histotech, which pretty much started me on this new career path, as well as learning how to do microscopy. So during that process, I completed 2 prestigious academic research internships at Gladstone Institutes and the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub in San Francisco. And then now I'm at a permanent position at UC Berkeley as a research associate in the Molecular Imaging Center, where I teach people how to use research microscopes to image their science. I started out in 2018 as an instructor's assistant in the Merritt Bioscience Department. In 2019, I began the Master of Public Health at the University of Nevada. I had always wanted a public health degree. I had wanted to be an epidemiologist and a pathologist. And then in 2019, I became an adjunct professor in the Merritt Bioscience Department. And in this year, I was promoted to the program director for the histotechnician program, and I am the co-director of the department. And then also this year, I began implementing a food security resources program that's a part of my field studies for my MPH for the Richmond Promise, which is in my hometown of Richmond, California. And it's a program that ensures that students stay on track as they pursue their 2-year, 4-year, and certificate higher education goals. Next slide, please. So part of the Merritt Bioscience program, which makes it so amazing and why I feel like this is a great place to stay and do my work, is that it helped me with my career transition, and the results are amazing. Trainees learn microscopy, histotechnology, which is basically taking biopsies and turning them into visible slides that pathologists can use to diagnose disease. And we train in genomics. Trainees go on to work in hospitals, academia, and industry. And the starting pay for histotechs who are certified is anywhere between 65 to 90K, depending on their degree and if they are certified or non-certified. We also have people going into research who start out at about 50K. And for those entry-level lab assistants, they're earning slightly more or a lot more than minimum wage. So this is a great place for students to come to get hands-on experience. Many of my trainees come to our program with a BS degree, a Bachelor of Science, and they come here to receive hands-on technical training. And other degree-seeking trainees get a full spectrum of training, which includes soft skills, presentation skills, and critical thinking. Next slide, please. So some of the things that I've implemented to increase diversity in our program have been starting to pay off. In the last year, we have seen in this new cohort of students that came in, we have 7 times the number of Black students who have been in this program. So this number here says 12, but we actually have 14 students who identify as African American, Black, or of African descent. And we have doubled our Latinx population as well. Not double, yeah, we doubled our number of students who identify as Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic. 85% of our incoming cohort identify as female. And our age, I'm really proud of this too. We have, I want to say, sorry, these are so hard to see, but about 40% of our students are over the age of 30, with a significant number over 40. So a lot of our people come to us to transition careers. And what makes this so important for me is that I'm here to help them do that, because I serve as a model And it was important that the current director and staff support having a woman of color in the lead of a STEM program, as well as the story in general, so we can create more of them. Next slide, please. And then just some of the equity check-ins that I've implemented too to keep retention is to check in and see how much of a scientist they feel like. So if we know that a student, this is the bottom question, if we ask students if they feel like a scientist and they say 1, we know they're going to need a little bit more hand-holding in this program and a little more support if they're a 1 or a 2 than if they're a 4 or a 5. Our goal here is to retain them through their transition. And the same question up above, is this your first, are you first gen? Because we have data that says that first gen students definitely need a little more support, okay? Next slide. Okay, so that wraps up just sort of my career transition and what I'm doing in my department with supporting other people in their current transitions. So my master's program focused on basic needs. And right now we are in a crisis. We were in a crisis before the pandemic, and it has only made it worse that we are currently in the state that we are in. Next slide, please. So I'll just read this. The problem is, while tuition has remained low at our community colleges, it is still difficult for most lower income students to achieve their educational goals due to the state's higher cost of living and the lack of adequate financial aid to cover non-tuition expenses, such as food. Food insecure students in particular are more likely to indicate intention of dropping out of school and less likely to feel confident in their academic abilities. Therefore, they may be forced to delay their education to make ends meet, setting them up for a cycle of poverty that can be increasingly difficult to break. A national effort is necessary to eliminate hunger as a barrier to student success and degree attainment. And this comes from language from the Food for Thought Act, which was entered by Adam Schiff, Congressman Adam Schiff of California, to support California community colleges over 3 years with $6 million. And, you know, that's one of the federal level type of solutions that are coming up now. But I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. Oh yeah, so this slide basically is, I know we're all here and we're all very, you know, about university and going to college, and we have to make sure that we're putting together solutions for the basic needs, because this top of here is achieving one's full potential. If we aren't making sure, if the basic needs are not being met, it's going to make it harder and harder for students to reach their full potential. And that's important to keep in mind when we're coming up with solutions, which we do here. We do keep that in mind at AAUW. Next slide, please. So some of my goals after spending about 150 hours and working on talking to students and other folks in this work, stakeholders, is after interviewing them, we want to create an early intervention program at the Richmond Promise that prepares students and helps them navigate their basic needs resources on the campuses. So I was uncovering a lot of broken links at many of our community colleges when folks are going to look for resources. The websites don't have the correct information, outdated information, links are broken. And so for the students who are at the Richmond Promise, the goal is to give them a heads up on the correct information and keep that information correct, so that they know how to navigate the top schools that Richmond students go to. So there's a few community colleges and for your institutions. We want to begin normalizing utilizing resources. One great thing that I've heard that a student came up with at San Francisco State is that CalFresh is just financial aid for food. CalFresh is California's version of SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. And it's one of those things, like the students just come up with the most amazing things, but CalFresh is just financial aid for food. No shame in going for and asking for that. There's one thing I want to make known here is that food for the first time is being considered part of the public charge rule, which means that if you're using public resources when your immigration status is before a judge, that can be considered against you. So students are not applying for CalFresh because of the how unclear the public charge rule is, or for fear that it will prevent them from getting their permanent status. So that's one more barrier to overcoming. The public charge rule did recently come into effect after being on pause because of the pandemic. Okay, and then the next goal I have is to provide the Richmond Promise leadership with enough data and information to advocate for real policy changes at the local, state, and federal level. Food pantries are wonderful. They provide a very important need, but there have got to become these local, state, and federal level policies that are put into place that cover food. And so that's what we're exploring now. And the report that I will end up giving the Richmond Promise. One of the great things that just happened is the National League of Cities, along with the city of Richmond and the Richmond Promise, along with 14 other cities, have partnered to come up with those policy changes at the city and state level. So that'll be something to look out for, in addition to the Food for Thought Act and the reversal of a lot of this administration's attack on assistance for public food assistance like SNAP programs. And then when I say this administration, I mean the Trump administration. The next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so this is me wrapping up. I just want to say thank you again. This has been wonderful. I am so empowered, and everyone who is speaking here today is so inspirational, and I'm so honored to be among you. Thank you.
Thank you, Feather, and thank you for persisting towards your goal. And it looks like you're pulling others right along with you. So thank you for that. Our final speaker of the day is Denise Mitchell. Denise is studying at UC Riverside. Her discipline is biology, and she is working towards an MS in botany and plant sciences. As a veteran science educator, Denise wishes to expand her expertise by diving into meaningful plant ecophysiology research aimed at understanding the strategies plants employ to tolerate drought and heat across ecosystems. With a sound knowledge base and university ties established, she will then create an engaging plant ecology course for high school students with the goal of providing the necessary key instruction in relevant environmental science topics amid today's critically changing climate. Denise.
Thank you, Judy, for that introduction. And I'm really enjoying listening to all the talks today. I feel very honored to be included in this group of amazing women. And so good afternoon. My name is Denise Marino Mitchell. Thank you to AAUW for a career development grant. And thank you for allowing me to share my story today. Her name is Brittany, and she was a student in my biology class in 2005. And every year since Brittany graduated from Martin Luther King High School, I receive a letter from her mother, Mrs. Ross, thanking me for inspiring her daughter and pointing her in the right direction. This last letter from her mother brought tears to my eyes because, you see, Brittany was in a general biology class and she defended her dissertation in bacteriology, earning her PhD in October of 2019. When I hear from my former students who have gone on to become scientists and engineers and doctors, my purpose becomes clear. I have been a science educator for 24 years, and thousands of students have passed through my classroom doors. How blessed am I to have had the opportunity to interact and to influence and to mentor so many. When asked what I do, it is neither teacher nor educator. Frankly, my response is usually, I get to hang out with teenagers all day. And I have taught primarily biology and chemistry. In every lesson, it has always been my intent to share the connections to the natural world with my students. And I had an opportunity to make this happen in a really big way As the advisor of the Interact Club, Interact is the high school chapter of Rotary International, where we focus on service above self. Next slide, please. As advisor, I was able to take students on a service learning trip in Ecuador, where the students visited a 100% sustainable community, Jungia, and we witnessed the farm-to-table lifestyle of the Ecuadorians. We put our hands into the deep, rich, dark, fertile soil at 10,000 feet in elevation in the Chimborazo province, alongside the indigenous people. And we assisted in planting potatoes and shearing sheep during the day. And we listened to the folklore of the Chimborazo volcano at night. And it was on this trip that I realized just how important it is for the next generation to develop a reverence for our planet. It was at the moment of sowing the seeds alongside my students that I decided to make the teachings of botany and plant sciences the focus of my career from that point forward. And more importantly, to teach students how they could be stewards for our planet. The epiphany was real. And when we returned to the States, I began making plans to apply to the graduate program at UC Riverside, because you see, if I am to be effective in my role as mentor to my students in becoming stewards for the natural world, I myself first must become a research scientist so that I may authentically stimulate their minds to follow a line of inquiry, to formulate questions, to test hypotheses, and to embrace meaningful and relevant research. Next slide, please. It really does feel like I've come full circle. You see, I left UC Riverside in 1989 with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. Was now the time to return to academia more than 30 years later as a graduate student, when my peers in my courses would be younger than my own children? To say that I was stepping out of my comfort zone is an understatement, but it didn't matter, because I was called on that beautiful day, admiring the dark, nutritive soil, 10,000 feet in elevation, with the volcano of Chimborazo in the background, to teach our youth to have reverence for our precious, vulnerable planet. And so I began the process of introducing myself to the professors in the Botany and Plant Sciences department at UCR. And these conversations were somewhat novel for the professors, and perhaps even left some of them scratching their heads. I recall one even affectionately exclaimed, "But Denise, you're a grandma." I did ultimately find alignment of my research interest in drought-resistant native flora with the research lab when I met and I chatted with Dr. Luis Santiago. Next slide, please. Living in Southern California my entire life, I have come to appreciate our native flora. And quite simply, we are surrounded by nature's beauty basket. And if we go coastal to the Mediterranean shrubland, one of 5 uniquely biodiverse regions across the globe, it's characterized by warm and dry summers coupled with mild, wet winters. And by bordering the ocean on the western side of the continent, the foggy conditions can moderate the climate, but without developing the clouds and the warm weather storms. And this unique geographical phenomenon provides for a wealth of species known as the coastal sage scrub and the chaparral. Next slide, please. And if we go inland from the coast and we lose the moderation effects of the marine layer, the range of the air temperature broadens significantly, and this gives rise to our serene Mojave Desert. Next slide, please. And then ascending in elevation, we witness yet another shift in our resident flora within the Idlewild mixed evergreen forest, with temperate summers and cold winters. These 3 distinct ecosystems provide for an ideal study framework, as there exists both a significant gradient in the mean annual temperature and the mean annual precipitation. Now, widespread woody plant mortality has been observed across these ecosystems, as the warmer temperatures amplify the effects of arid conditions. So I seek to understand the resource allocation by the plant to sustain respectable water potentials, to minimize the heat damage, and to ultimately gain enough carbon to maintain the plant body integrity. The objective of my research is to characterize the coordination of drought tolerance and heat tolerance in these woody species. And more specifically, I am quantifying the trigger loss point due to drought and photosynthesis decline due to heat. Next slide, please. At the trigger loss point, the leaf wilts. Now, who of us has not seen this upon arriving home from vacation? The trigger loss point is the point at which the water potential in the leaf cells is only dependent on the water solute potential without the hydrostatic pressure component. So utilizing a relatively new protocol involving a vaporosmometer, I can more rapidly determine the trigger loss point parameter. Now, trigger loss point varies significantly between species. And further, some species can survive exceptionally low water potentials well past the trigger loss point. But surviving this stress does not come without a cost. So the plant may need to invest in putting down deep roots to have access to the water table, or efficiently control the stomata to minimize water loss while still gaining carbon. And one well-documented avoidance strategy is the drought deciduous growth habit. And that is where the plant will shed leaves during the dry periods and then grow new leaves when more favorable conditions return. But I question, how is it that the woody species that do not avoid these stresses by dropping their leaves survive not only the aridity, but the extreme heat as well? Next slide, please. It has been proposed that electron transport is the leading limiting step of photosynthesis at high temperature. So keeping this in mind, I designed my experiments for heat tolerance to utilize chlorophyll A fluorescence as a proxy for photosynthetic efficiency. And from this data and using statistical software, I can pull out my heat tolerance parameter, T50, the temperature at 50% quantum yield of photosystem 2. Next slide, please. My primary research question is, does there exist a statistically significant correlation between the trigger loss point and T50 within ecosystems and also across ecosystems? And as I work through my data analysis in my research, I am learning to let the data speak to me and not the other way around. For example, when I look at my most recent culmination of data from my visit to the desert in July, why is it that 6 out of 7 of my species seem to follow a similar trend? What can I learn about Justicia californica, commonly known as chiporosa, that distinguishes it as an outlier? But as is the case with research, more data will generate more questions. So for example, if it is the hydraulic system that starts sacrificing itself before the photosystems get really damaged, which is what the scientific literature would suggest, which aspect of the photosystem is failing first? Is it an enzymatic process or possibly membrane integrity, which ultimately will halt the efficiency of the photosystems? Do woody species with higher relative heat tolerance possess particularly resilient membranes? Could this be the case with Justicia californica, chiporosa, that is displaying a relatively high heat tolerance coupled with a low drought tolerance? Next slide, please. Ultimately, I will write my manuscript, complete my master's thesis, and share my enthusiasm with future students by writing a high school course in botany to include a fieldwork component. And perhaps I may ignite a spark that would foster a love of our California flora in one of my students and prompt them to become involved in research, utilizing tools like species distribution modeling for California, mapping predictions of where habitat is today and sadly may or may not be in the future. Next slide, please. I would like to close by borrowing a quote from the renowned naturalist Sir David Attenborough, speaking about the first photos of the Earth taken from the Apollo spacecraft in 1968. Upon being presented this image of the Earth, Attenborough recollects the realization that our home was not limitless. There was an edge to our existence, and it was a rediscovery of a fundamental truth. We are ultimately bound by and reliant upon the finite natural world about us. And if I may humbly continue, is it the case that it is only when our relationship with the natural world improves will we see an improvement in our relationships with each other? Next slide, please. The progress that I've made thus far in my research would not have been possible without the generosity of AAUW. Thank you for allowing my vision to take root. And to Riverside East Rotary and Dr. Luis Santiago and all listed here for helping me to achieve my goals.
Thank you very much, Denise. That's very inspiring. And thanks for taking that leap from teacher to student. I know that moving out of your comfort zone is not always easy. So thank you for doing that, and best wishes to all to doing that. And now we want to thank all of our speakers for their wonderful presentations today. We heard from 10 amazing women. And aren't you proud to be an AUW member and to be supporting these women who are following in the footsteps of great scholars and will do wonderful things in the world in the days to come? So thank you all very much. Now we're going to move to talking about something very important, and Sharman Gearing is here. We're not going to have questions today. We only have a couple of questions, and we're going to answer those offline so that we can move on and end today. So Sharman is going to talk to us about the Legacy Circle, and then Judy Cavan Brown will close the day.
Hi, everyone. Boy, I'm looking at a picture. Look how thin my face looks compared to now. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you to all of the fellow and grant recipients for sharing your work. It almost makes me want to go back to school myself. I said almost. And also give a shout out to all of the Legacy Circle members who are on the call. You can recognize the Legacy Circle member by the lovely pin that they'll be wearing that was designed by former AAUW Educational Foundation President Ann Lydell. And I want to tell you a little bit about my own personal story with the Legacy Circle. If you were on a couple of weeks ago, as I was, you heard Judy Horan. I thought she stole my story at first because it sounded very similar. But honestly, my first desire to be in the Legacy Circle was really because of my ego. I was on the national board, and I was the youngest member by about 25 or 30 years. And almost everybody had that pin, and I wanted one too. And I realized that as a single parent who was a public school teacher, I didn't have the deep pockets that most of those women had. But I had a conversation, as did Judy Horan, with one of the younger women who was the development director, Catherine at the time. And she enlightened me that it doesn't matter about how much money you have or how big your accounts are, your 401ks. It's more about the commitment. And it's a commitment to AEW and our women and girls in the future. And there's multiple ways of leaving a legacy gift. And so with that information, I went and became a member of the Legacy Circle by dedicating a portion of a 401k in the future to AEW. It was very simple. There's an easy form online now where you can actually get a hard brochure if you desire that. I'm happy to say this is my 20th year in AEW, and my ego is now out of the way, and I enjoy being a member of the Legacy Circle because of my commitment to AEW and my commitment to women and girls now as well as in the future. And you all can have a part of that as well. We don't want to be an exclusive group. We'd like to welcome everybody into the Legacy Circle, especially if you are a 30-year member or more. You've shown by your commitment in making that renewal check every year that you are really dedicated to this organization, helping these wonderful women we heard today. And I'm really speaking to those of you, and we would love to have you make that commitment. You might have heard about a contest we have going on in California called California's In It to Win It. And this is a move to increase the number of Legacy Circle members in California. Judy and I are competitive, and we have a group of team around the country of coordinators, and we like to have new members be in California and be able to say that we have the most members. But we also want to help branches. Right now we have a 5-star program that many branches are working towards, and one of the requirements is to add a Legacy Circle member to your branch, from your branch. And so the contest helps to promote that as well. We have it's wrapping up at the end of November. So if you are thinking or considering it, please do so. Your branch with the branch with the most members will be having a special Zoom session with Diane Owens, as well as Heather Miller, who you heard earlier, probably Judy, myself, and Judy Kevin Brown. And who knows, maybe another special guest or two will be able to join in for that lucky branch. So I hope that you will reach out to either myself or Judy Horan, who is in the South, and our information is on the website. And if you have any other questions about the Legacy Circle, please let us know. We'd be happy to award you with your own Legacy Circle pin in the coming months. Probably be mailing it rather than actually doing it in person. And I just want to give one last plug too for making a donation today. Normally when we have these funds luncheons, we are paying, $45 or so for a lunch, and we're driving to the event. We didn't have that cost today. It would be great to make that donation to AAUW, and especially to the Greatest Needs Fund. The Greatest Needs Fund, if you're not aware, funds almost all of the projects that we love and hold dear in AAUW. And it really could use some help right now to help us remain flexible and nimble in the future. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you for joining the Legacy Circle if you desire that, and those of you who already are. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharman. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for our speakers. Wonderful job, ladies. We are short on time, so I'm just going to get a little last plug in for making a donation. Go push that button, make a donation, and reminding you please to vote. Don't forget to vote. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good rest of your weekend.